Are you going to do those? Good morning, everybody. Thanks for coming. We've been polling on issues of America in the Middle East now for well over a decade, and the numbers have gone through a whole series of ups and downs, pretty much downs, beginning in the immediate period after 9/11. We saw a worsening of America's attitude toward America across the Middle East. The war in Iraq took a toll. Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo took a toll. Neglect of the Israel-Palestine issue took a toll. In 2008, numbers were quite low. Not as low as they were in 2006, when the toll of all of those issues combined were really quite dramatic. By 2008, we were in the midst of a presidential contest, and we saw the beginnings of a change. People began to see the possibility that something might occur. In 2009, within 100 days after the election of Barack Obama, we did a survey, and we saw numbers in the region spike, doubling in most countries. Favorable attitudes towards America climbed. The president had sent many signals in his inaugural address, in his initial interview with Al Arabiya, in his appointment of George Mitchell and the early statements by the administration on a range of issues involving a commitment to get out of Iraq, to close Guantanamo, to end torture, and to move forward on the Arab-Israeli peace process. By the time of his speech in Cairo, numbers were at their highest. We polled this year, 2 years after Cairo. We waited actually until after the president gave his State Department speech, because we knew that the survey was going to take between 3 to 4 weeks in different countries to get done. And you don't want to, in a survey that's a face-to-face survey that takes over an extended period of time, to do it while there's some dramatic event going on. So you can't do it in the middle of the bombing of Libya. You can't do it while there's events unfolding that could be problematic. And so we waited until after that State Department speech, and we began polling that day. And what we found was that numbers had dropped rather precipitously since 2009. And when we compared them, they were actually lower in most countries across the Arab world, lower than they were in 2008, the last year of the Bush administration. The picture there makes it clear that actually only in Lebanon was there a plateau reached, and that's largely, if you look at the crosstabs, because of the sectarian divides in Lebanon. The numbers get pretty well locked in place. In Saudi Arabia, numbers were higher than they were in 2008. It's the only country that they were, but still significantly lower than they were in 2009. If you continue looking on through the report, you will see that attitudes towards America are not only low, but are low in lower in every Arab country than even in Iran, except in Saudi Arabia, where Iran's numbers are lowest. What are the reasons? The reasons are expectations created and expectations let down. The two biggest issues that trouble people in the Middle East are the continuing occupation of Palestinian lands and U.S. interference in the Arab world. Those are the two biggest obstacles viewed to peace and stability, and the U.S. is held responsible in many ways for both issues. I noted, and it notes in the report, that Arabs were hopeful after the election of Barack Obama. If you look at the chart F, you will see that in most Arab countries, there was people, even till this day, will say that they were hopeful after he was elected. Now, I should explain that in some countries they say they weren't hopeful, but that's because 2 years down the road, people aren't willing to admit sometimes that they were hopeful, or as we do, when you poll today, you ask who did you vote for in the last election. Some people won't say that they voted for the winner if the winner's numbers are down, or they won't say they voted for the loser. So people don't always have they don't always give you answers that are identical to what they did, But nevertheless, it's a fairly good measure to find out that, yes, in Morocco, in Egypt, in Jordan, in Saudi Arabia, people said they were quite hopeful. But then if you look at G, which is the next one, has President Obama met the expectations you had that were set in that speech, you'll see that he simply did not. And with the exception of UAE, numbers are almost in the single-digit range in every country. In UAE, there's still a low, only 28% think he met expectations. And ranking President Obama's performance and policies over and against other leaders that are of importance in the Middle East, Erdogan in Turkey, and Ahmadinejad in Iran, and Sarkozy in France, and King Abdullah in Saudi Arabia, President Obama's numbers are the lowest of all of them, except in Saudi Arabia, where Ahmadinejad is a reviled figure. Then, on the question of U.S. policies and how those policies have played out, the two biggest issues the president has focused on has been his engagement in the Muslim world and Palestine. And you can see that those are the two issues where he's actually done most poorly. And I think, again, it's because expectations were created. Expectations that weren't met. The no-fly zone over Libya only receives a very favorable rating in Saudi Arabia. And then in Lebanon, there's a division in the ranks on that issue. But the numbers overall are not good. How important is it for the U.S. to address these issues? Palestine comes out always number one. And after that is ending the Iraq War. The other issues are of minimal importance, except in Saudi Arabia, where Iran's nuclear program becomes a matter of enormous consequence. We surveyed on the killing of bin Laden and found that it was not a significant issue, not an issue of importance to people in the region. In fact, many Arabs said it worsened their attitude toward the United States. I was asked about that over the last couple of days, what that might mean. And look, the problem is that it was a display of power. When you are not viewed as a friendly power, any display of power, even if it's defending civilians in Libya or killing bin Laden, two projects that one might say are necessary, even if you do that, it is not going to be viewed as something that's going to improve people's appreciation of you. I said yesterday rather irreverently that it was sort of like if your neighbor was fooling around with your wife for the last couple of years and comes over one day and trims your bushes and takes your garbage out. It's not something that's going to be viewed by you as a compensation or a makeup. Those aren't the problems. Your problems with your neighbor weren't your bushes. The problems weren't your garbage. The problem is he's doing something you don't want him to be doing. And as long as the U.S. is perceived as not moving forward on Palestine, as not ending the Iraq War and ending its interference in the region, then acts, even positive or constructive acts, are not going to receive strong, favorable ratings. Finally, we asked a series of questions about Arab Spring and Arab attitudes towards Arab Spring. And what we found basically was that it's too early to tell. There's a bit of anticipation. I would say that those three numbers in those three charts were maybe the most interesting. On the one hand, we find that when asked, has it made the region better off, the majority or the plurality say it's too early to tell. When you ask the next question, which is as a result of this, has your country gotten better off or worse off? We get a fairly better off, but not an overwhelming better off. No impact rates highest in Jordan, almost highest in Saudi Arabia, and at least a third in Egypt and in Morocco and Lebanon, where it's evenly divided. Are you better off than you were, or worse off than you were 5 years ago? always a measure that we use. You can see that the better off numbers today are lower than they were in 2009. That's that sense of tentativeness. Not quite sure if I'm better off, not quite sure whether things have actually improved in my country, especially in Egypt, where the country has had the most dramatic upheaval in the countries that we've polled. But look in Saudi Arabia. It's the one country where the better off numbers are the best, and that's the country least touched by the Arab Spring. Finally, how do you feel you'll be better off or worse off in the next 5 years? The optimism levels are very high. So while there's a tentativeness now, there's an optimism about the future. I think I'll end it right there by saying that these expectations now about their own lives can be as dramatic and as potentially problematic in terms of a letdown as the expectations created 2 years ago by the president's election. The point is that Arabs are waiting for change from America, waiting for change in their own lives, and they've not yet seen either change from America, but they're hopeful that they'll now see changes in their own lives, but not quite sure. So there's that tentativeness that I think is the region is in a precarious position, and I think we ought to be paying attention to that. 2 weeks from now, we'll be releasing the second half of this survey, which focuses exclusively on Iran's relationship with the region and with the issues involving GCC and this newly empowered GCC role in the region. We'll be letting you know about that in 2 weeks. So I'll stop right there and take any questions you have. Yeah.
What's the message this poll finding is giving to the U.S. policymakers?
Well, I think it's something they already know. I had a very short conversation with the president about a month ago. Told him we were polling in the region, and he said, I expect that America's numbers are going to be low. And I said, why? And he said, until we solve the Arab-Israeli conflict, people aren't going to believe us. And he knows it. I think this shouldn't be a surprise to folks at the White House. And as I've said, the president didn't get a magic wand when he took the oath of office. He got the shovel that George Bush had been using to dig deep holes. And getting out of those holes has been far more difficult than I think this administration expected. I don't think they expected the resistance that they were going to get in Congress from both parties. Does any U.S. president expect that when he lays down a marker for an Israeli prime minister, that prime minister will be invited then by the opposition party to Congress to receive more standing ovations than the president of the country receives himself? I don't think he expects that. And so if that's not what we normally expect in terms of domestic behavior, I think the president is right to understand he's got a problem. It's not made easier by domestic politics. And it's going to be tough getting out of these holes. But what message it should send is that we've got interests that we've got to be attentive to, and the consequences of not paying attention can be a dramatic souring of attitudes that could have consequences in the future in that region. The region's growing away from us, not growing towards us. Yeah? Here?
Is there a particular country that surprised you? And why so?
I would say no, in the sense that I expected Saudi attitudes to be up. Saudi Arabia feels that, and Saudi citizens feel, it may be counterintuitive here, in the sense that the notion in this country is that they're not a democracy, they didn't have Arab Spring, they're afraid to blah, blah, blah. That doesn't seem to be the case. The case is that Saudis are pretty satisfied. Right now, they've got problems. They have a youth bulge they have to address. We've been polling on that in other surveys. 350,000 young people coming into the job market. The king has taken dramatic measures and stimulus to sort of create jobs, but they're all in the public sector. And the question is, can Saudi Arabia sustain over the long haul this absorption of 350,000 people in middle-class paying jobs in the public sector? I don't think so. They're going to have to create a private sector. They're going to have to move in that direction to absorb those people. But right now, in the short term, Saudi Arabians are feeling fairly satisfied and very optimistic. Egypt, I think we've known, is tentative. And we're seeing the demonstrations playing out in the country right now. People expected change. They haven't gotten change. They may be misdirecting their focus on putting people in jail, but the root cause of this is the economy, as it's always been in Egypt. People don't have jobs. People aren't surviving. Tourism is down. The country is in desperate straits and needs help. I think the president focused on that in his State Department message, that we actually have to begin to move to help build capacity and create jobs. Those are the two things that America can do, that the region wants us to do, and we've got to do them. Lebanon is, as always, divided. It's red state, blue state, writ large, except it's red state, blue state, purple state. It's got many states. It's got many different divisions across the board that sort of create a sort of a confusing mix of numbers. So I would say no, the numbers validated what we knew. I hope they're not a surprise to people in the administration. I think that, like I said, I think the president knows we've got trouble. But it ought to be a wake-up call to those who think that we don't have a problem. To those who think that all we had to do is do a no-fly zone in Libya and everybody loves us now. Or those who think that, just a few more bombs dropped here or there, and actually people would like us. Look at the numbers on what is the single biggest issue for peace and stability in the region. It's Palestine, and then it's U.S. interference. It's not democracy, and it's not economic inequality. Those are the things that people still think about. And if anything, what we should be learning is that, and I'm not pitching my book, but Arab voices matter. What Arabs think matters about their own lives. And they're telling us something that we may not be ready to listen to. We are not, John McCain going off to Cairo and giving marching orders about you ought to be doing this and doing that. We're not, if with a 5% favorable rating in Egypt, we may not be the guys to be dictating terms as what Egyptians ought to be doing or not be doing. And I think the president has been especially smart in that regard. In his State Department speech, his message about humility was very important to recognize. And we didn't create Arab Spring. We can't direct its course. All we can do is be helpful. And helpful when asked to be helpful and not impose ourselves. The region's not looking for us to impose ourselves. Yeah?
It seems from the numbers that basically the respondents gave no credit for this administration's attempts to work very hard to try to promote these issues. I mean, the Americans are pulling out of Iraq. The president did appoint special envoy for the Middle East on the second day. So, I mean, why there is no positive response for this try?
You get the credit for trying after the 100 days, which is where those numbers were so high after the 100 days. But after 2 years, you no longer get credit for trying. You get credit then for producing. And the production has not been there. And the president knows that. The administration knows that and is frustrated. I think that, look, I'm a critic of the policy, but I understand the burdens he faces. They can't get a deficit reduction deal. They can't get a deal on taxes. They had to struggle with health care. They faced an opposition party that welcomed the head of a foreign country to come to speak to Congress to insult directly the President of the United States and gave him standing ovations in the process. That's not an easy hill to climb. And so I'm not faulting the president, but I'm pointing out that this has been a tough row to hoe. And expectations were created in Cairo. Expectations were created with the appointment of George Mitchell. And those expectations have not been met. And the consequences of not meeting the expectations are you end up with numbers like this.
Can I ask the second part of the question?
But let me just say, it goes back to that rather awkward metaphor about the next door neighbor. I mean, the fact is that the things we've done have not been the things that the people in the region needed us to do, or wanted us to do, or expected us to do. And so those are the difficulties that are facing us. We promised to deal with Israel-Palestine. We know General Petraeus has said, the President has said, it's in the national security interests of the United States. Even as timid a marker as the 67 borders with land swaths, we had to pull back from. And now, when we're trying to get Israelis and Palestinians to the negotiating table, and the Europeans are saying, let's use that as the starting point, the U.S. side is saying, we can't make that the starting point. 67 borders with land swaps. The Israelis won't accept it. So we can't even endorse our own president's speech. So why would the region then be giving us credit for not being able to for not being able to do what we said we would do on multiple occasions? Okay.
These numbers. I mean, aren't you afraid that it will kind of stimulate some isolationist position if the outreach to the region didn't work? So why do you should bother to be involved?
I labor over numbers like this when I do them. But the point is, you have to tell the truth. I mean, what would be the point of saying "great job, guys," or hiding the fact that you're not doing a great job? I worked with a guy running for president a while back, and I remember he gave a speech that was very clear to me. He hadn't read it before he gave it, and he stumbled through it. And after it was all over, people were patting him on the back. Aides were saying, "Great job! You did a great job. It was a powerful job." And he came over to me and said, "Well, how did I do?" And I said, "It didn't work. You didn't read it before you gave it." And they came to me afterwards. They said, "What'd you tell him that for? You deflated him." And I said, "Somebody had to tell him the truth." I mean, the point is that if we get numbers like this and we don't tell ourselves the truth, then we don't know where we are. And one of the problems of America in the Middle East is because we don't listen to Arab voices. We don't know where we're standing. We're operating in the region as if everybody loves us, and they don't. We're operating in the region as if we're doing everything right, and we're not. And there are consequences when you give 28 to 35, depending upon who was counting, standing ovations to the Prime Minister of Israel to insult your own president. When you go to the United Nations and veto a resolution on settlements that is the very language that you have used yourself to describe those settlements, there are going to be consequences in the region for that behavior. And so you can't have it both ways. You can't be cheating on your own principles and expect people to say, "You guys are great," or at least we're not going to talk about you not being great. Or why are you being ingrates for not recognizing that we're trying? The fact is that we're doing a pretty poor job right now. People know it. I think we know it. And all we're doing right now is just talking about it. Yeah? Here.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, based on these numbers and the Arab Spring, and specifically the absence of America in the Arab Spring, whatever as an agitator or as an enemy. There's no anti-American slogans, whatever, Tunis, Yemen, or Cairo. Some people are arguing this like the sign of the beginning of the end of the U.S. influence in the Middle East. And the peoples of the area decided to move away from the U.S. and having hopes or frustrations on it once and for all.
Look, there is no question that Arab Spring has been an act of self-empowerment. No question. This is the region saying, you guys have not been able to do this, we're doing it on our own. And I think that's very important. There's also no question that it has ground, in effect, in a real sense. It's ground itself down. And there's a lack of movement here. Expectations were created by Arab Spring, as the numbers show, that have not been fulfilled. And so the region is in this precarious position. And I think if you go back to the president's speech at the State Department, there was the humility factor. We did not start this. We did not inspire this. We have not directed it, and we can't determine its outcome. But we can help. And he laid out the terms of how we can help. And our polling going back at least a decade has said, and I've argued with the past two administrations, but the president gets it. The two things we can do are job creation and capacity building. People need health care. People need education. People need jobs and investment. And the administration announced all those programs. About Egypt, they created an enterprise fund. The point is that we've announced those programs, but if I looked at that State Department speech as anything, I looked at it as a very finely honed message to Congress. Don't let me down. Don't let the people of this region down. Don't cut foreign aid programs when the region needs the one thing we can do, which is help invest in their future. If Egyptians don't get jobs, this revolution goes sour. If Tunisians don't see their lives improving, that revolution will sour. And so I think that there still is a role that America can play, but the role is one outlined by the president, and that is job creation, capacity building, helping people improve their lives so that they can make better decisions in the future. And we can solve the Arab-Israeli conflict. Those are the things people expect from us, and those are the things they want most from us. And so we've got things we can do. We still are relevant. I don't want to get into the American exceptionalism argument. I don't think that that's true, and I think Arab Spring showed that's not true. But can we remain a partner? Can we be helpful in transition? Absolutely. But we're not even doing that. The money has not been forthcoming. The programs have not been started. There are the Enterprise Fund, which Secretary Clinton announced, great idea for Egypt's private sector. It's not happening. Right now, Egyptians need a chicken in every pot. It's not happening. And so we had the revolution in Tahrir Square. The next comes the revolution of the hungry. People saying, where are the jobs? Where's the food? Where's the change in our lives? And I think that America has a role, not the role we saw for ourselves, but a role nevertheless. The question is, will we assume that role and do the right thing? Yes?
Is there any credibility, even in this field of helping after the revolution? During Tahrir Square and elsewhere, I'm not asking for aid from the U.S. Even these are voluntary statements from the State Department, White House. Yeah. We're going to do this, we're going to do that. They end up doing nothing. Yeah. So if they end up losing credibility in this field as well, in addition to the peace process and Iraq, and that's why we go to the point: is this the beginning of the end of the U.S. presence and influence in the Middle East as we know it?
It certainly remarks a transition. Look, I thought from the beginning that the Project for a New American Century, there was a certain irony, a cruel irony to the fact that the very project and the way that it was implemented ended up doing the opposite of what it sought to do. It sought to project American power in a decisive way so as to secure American hegemony for the next century. It ended up displaying America's weakness and vulnerability. It ended up isolating America more than ever before. These numbers are a reflection of that. Barack Obama inherited this problem. He didn't create this problem. He created expectations that he'd solve the problem, has not been able to do them. Do I think we still can? Yes, I do. But we have to get over partisan politics to be able to do it. We have to have the resolve of a country understanding that we're in a precarious position in a very important region of the world in order to do it. I don't think that we're at that point yet. Like I said, we can't bail out our country and resolve partisan politics, no less figure out a constructive way of playing a role in the Middle East. So it could be a very decisive turning point. Doesn't have to be if we make the right choices. I'm just not confident yet that we're at that point. But it certainly does give, I think these numbers give the administration or right-thinking people in both parties the ammunition to say, we've got to make some choices. Do we want to write this region out? Do we want to write ourselves out of the region? Or do we want to play a constructive role in the future? If we do, we've got to start doing the right thing. Now, I would say that there are some projects underway that I think are really significant. seen groups of Arab American business people, for example, working with the State Department and agencies of government, talking about investment in Egypt and Tunisia in particular, as a way of improving opportunities post-Arab Spring. It hasn't happened yet, but we're on the track to doing it, and I think that's important. So let's look at this as a warning. Let's look at this as a signal of where we have to go, and let's look at it as maybe a final call. Do it, or you could be in real trouble in the years to come. Back here.
Also on the subject of economic assistance and capacity building, a recent Gallup poll reported that about 50% of Egyptians oppose economic aid to their country, in addition to just basic U.S. political engagement. Do you have any suggestions as to how the U.S. can restructure its economic assistance and aid policies in the Middle East in order to better garner public support?
Look, the aid programs that we've run in the past were sort of the equivalent of the story of the Boy Scout who was insistent on helping the old lady across the street, except she didn't want to go. We designed our programs, we implemented in the region without consultation. They were not demand-driven programs, or we boasted, as we did in the case of Egypt, that 82 cents on the dollar got spent here at home, with consultancies and with American companies and with American products. Again, people didn't want them. It was a way of boosting the American economy. I think that the decision that was made that allowed the secretary to announce the programs she announced a couple months back that included the enterprise fund, for example, marked a turning point. Creating public-private partnerships that invest in the private sector in Egypt, that help job-creating programs get started, projects get started, and help small business people get started. That's really an important difference. The creation of partnerships, moving away from sort of AID-dominated projects. I mean, look, Israel's the only country in the world that gets a check up front, no questions asked, deposits it in the bank, collects interest on it for the money they don't use, and spends it as they will with no AID and no GAO accounting. It's by law, we cannot account for the money we give them. And we cannot ask them to account for the money they get. Every other country's aid gets managed by AID and micromanaged by AID, and actually they end up paying for 400 or 500 employees, AID employees, that are there to micromanage the money. And the money, like I said, gets spent back in America. Nothing against AID, but the fact is that it's not an effective way of helping the country. So when people say they don't want aid, it's because aid hasn't been effective. I mean, I remember going to Gaza right after the peace process, a couple of years in, seeing this apartment complex in Gaza with a billboard out front, gift of the American people to the people of Gaza. The problem was every unit in that building sold for $94,000 a unit in a part of the world where the per capita income is $600 a person back then. It was more of a taunt than it was aid. It was not demand driven. It was not. We didn't go to people in Gaza and say, "What do you need? What do you want? What can we do to work with you?" Now, when Hillary Clinton went to Casablanca for the Forum of the Future in 2009, when she went to Doha for the Forum of the Future in 2010, all the programs she announced were partnership programs, a decisive term. Partnership programs in science and technology, partnership programs in medicine, in women's empowerment, in youth empowerment, in educational advancement. Now the enterprise fund idea. The point is we've got to deliver on those programs. If we deliver on those programs, make a difference in people's lives, we might be viewed a little bit differently in the region. But if the aid that we give are projects they don't want or don't need, or military assistance that God knows they don't need, then in fact, why would people say they want American aid? Why would they want American aid if the aid is only really benefiting American companies, not benefiting them, and in fact, in some cases, creating more problems than it is creating benefits for the country? So I think that 50% rejection is probably a rational response, but it's also a message. Change the way we do business, and I think that the administration is doing that. Congress just has to step up and make it happen. Yeah?
In the past, Arabs used to dislike our foreign policy but like our democracy. Is that the case today?
Still, the numbers we get still show that they like us, they like our people, they like our culture, they like our values. They just don't think we like them. And the way that they measure that we don't like them is how we treat them. And so that's the problem, and it still is. It still is. Anything else?
Thank you.
We have two online questions, Jim. First being a reaction from the White House to the numbers, and the second being why the Saudi Arabia numbers are so different.
Reaction from the White House is they expected. They expected the numbers to be what they are. Disappointed, but expected. And the Saudi Arabia numbers, I think Saudi Arabia has been doing very well. The UAE numbers ought to track Saudi Arabia, but the difference is that we're not just polling Emiratis. In the Emirates, we poll Emiratis and Arabs. These are Arabs in the Emirates, and so we have a lot of Egyptians, a lot of Lebanese, a lot of Palestinians, a lot of other Arabs working in the country, reflecting the attitudes of people from the countries that they come from. Whereas in Saudi Arabia, it's largely a poll of Saudi citizens. And so I think you look at the Saudi numbers and you can see a reflection of what Gulf Arab attitudes are, which are they're doing pretty well. They're feeling empowered. They're feeling like they've got a future. They're feeling like they've been insulated from the economic shock. Remember, if we're looking at American numbers that are the result of an economic collapse over the last several years, Saudi Arabia was insulated from that collapse by two things. One was the stimulus package that the king introduced almost immediately, followed by another stimulus package, and then supplemented by a dramatic increase in oil revenues. And so this is a country that didn't have an economic turndown. Now, Dubai had an economic turndown unrelated to the broader issues, but created a shock in the country. But still, UAE numbers are fairly good. So I think that's the difference right there. A different setting, still very dramatically tied to the issues in the region, but not feeling as negative about themselves or the future. Yeah?
Very trivial question that many conservatives in this country might ask. If they don't like us, why should we vote? And do you have an answer to it?
I think that you would probably get a response from many people in the region who would say, just leave us alone. And leave the region alone, which is something, of course, we won't do. And so the issue is if we're willing to write off the region, as the question before was asked, and if we're willing to not give $3 billion a year to Israel and underwrite every policy that they pursue and support their issues at the United Nations. If we're willing not to take a side and simply walk away from the region, Arabs would say that's a pretty good deal. We'll take it. Some of the governments in the region probably wouldn't, but I think that people probably would. That's that U.S. interfering in our lives number, which is so high. So I think that's if the Ron Paul vision were implemented, you would probably find a lot of people in the Arab world feeling pretty good about things. Don't go into Iraq. Don't bomb this country. Don't use drones. Don't do this. Don't do that. I personally think that's not a good policy to pursue. I think that there's a saner way that America can respond than that sort of isolationist absolutism. But you asked what the people in the region would think, and I think you'd get a lot of supporters saying, yeah, good.
I'm sorry if you addressed this question wrong, but would you say that, public opinion polls matter more now than they did, say, 5, 10, 15 years ago? Because, societies in the Arab world are opening up more in response to the
Sure.
Arab Spring, so should the White House, should the U.S. be facing this?
I'd say, look, and I thought that, number one, yes, the region knows that now. And so I've argued that regardless of whether or not these revolutions are completed, and whether or not some countries have them or don't have them, Arab leaders will now pay attention to what their people are thinking, much more so than they did in the past. That's number one. Israel could not do what it did in Gaza, could not do what it did in Lebanon, and find Egypt quiescent as they were able to find them quiescent in the past. That is not going to happen in the future, and that's an issue I think everyone is now going to contend with. I also think America understands that, or at least thoughtful people in America understand it. Maybe the most fascinating line by the president in his speech to AIPAC was not the 67 border line, but it's when he said that everything now changes, that in the past you were able to make peace with just two leaders, but now you've got to come up with a deal that will be accepted by Arab people in general. That he understands it's a whole new world out there. I think the question is convincing people here in America that it's a whole new world out there, and we have to deal more respectfully with the region. I don't know if that's the case. If people bought my book, they might, which incidentally is called Arab Voices. No, I mean, I think that's the whole point. Arab voices matter, and matter now more than ever. Absolutely. Okay, thank you all very much. On this poll, since it's been completed, it's not the president. I spoke to the president before the poll was done.
But you said that you were.
Yeah.
You step up and kind of, so you're fine. We're fine.